Sometimes the most dangerous question a man can ask is the one he thinks he already knows the answer to. 2 hours before a decorated officer would find himself standing at attention in the rain, Officer Daniel Brooks saw nothing more than a dark sedan drifting slightly over the white line on a quiet stretch of highway just outside the city limits. The red and blue lights painted the wet asphalt in streaks of authority as he stepped out of his cruiser, shoulders squared, badge catching the glow. Inside the stopped vehicle sat a black woman in her 40s, posture straight, hands resting calmly on the steering wheel at 10 and 2. She didn't look nervous. She didn't look apologetic. She looked steady. That steadiness irritated him more than any raised voice could have. He tapped on the window. License and registration. His tone was clipped, rehearsed, the kind that expected compliance before conversation. She handed over her ID without argument. Monica Hayes. The name meant nothing to him. He glanced at the address, an Arlington, Virginia residence on a street known for quiet wealth, and handed her a tight smile that didn't reach his eyes. Step out of the vehicle, ma'am. Rain misted in the air, cool against the skin, about 60 degrees and falling. She opened the door slowly and stood, about 5'8", composed, meeting his stare without defiance, but without submission either. A passing driver slowed down. Then another. A phone camera appeared from a sidewalk 20 yards away. Brooks felt the shift in atmosphere and mistook it for a challenge. You crossed the line back there. You in a hurry? She shook her head once. No, officer. Her voice was even, low, controlled. Not pleading. Not sharp. Controlled. The word echoed in his mind. He circled the car, flashlight beam cutting through tinted glass though it was barely past sunset. Inside, neatly folded in the back seat, was a pressed military jacket beneath a protective garment bag. He paused. You military or something? He asked, half smirking. She didn't answer immediately. The silence stretched 3 seconds too long. I serve, she said finally. The words were simple, but something in the way she said them carried weight. Brooks felt a flicker of uncertainty and buried it under procedure. Hands where I can see them. She complied again, eyes forward, rain collecting on her shoulders. Imagine standing there, doing everything right, and still feeling like you're being measured for something you didn't apply for. The small crowd grew. The flashing lights reflected off puddles like warning signals from another world. Brooks leaned closer, lowering his voice. Who do you think you are? It wasn't really a question. It was a declaration of rank. She looked at him then, directly, calmly, and in that look there was no fear, only patience, as if she had seen storms louder than this one. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled. He thought he was the highest authority on that road. He had no idea he had just stopped someone who commanded forces far beyond his cruiser's headlights. Rain gathered along the edge of the highway, rolling off the hood of the cruiser in steady drops that sounded louder than they should have in the thickening silence. Officer Daniel Brooks studied Monica Hayes as if waiting for her composure to crack, but it did not. She stood with her hands visible, shoulders back, eyes level, not challenging him, not shrinking either. The small crowd across the street had grown to half a dozen people now, phones raised, their screens glowing in the dim light. Brooks felt the pressure of being watched and mistook it for disrespect. Authority, in his mind, was something you asserted before it slipped away. Turn around, he instructed. His voice was firm, rehearsed, the voice of someone who believed procedure was always on his side. Monica complied without hesitation. The rain darkened the fabric of her jacket. Her breathing remained steady, slow enough to be intentional. Imagine holding your dignity like that, even when someone is determined to misunderstand you. Brooks asked a few more questions, rapid, pointed, layered with assumptions he did not bother to hide. Where are you headed at this hour? Why is there a military garment bag in the back seat? Are you carrying any weapons? Each question landed heavy in the damp air. Her answers were concise. I am returning home. It is my uniform. No, officer. No anger. No trembling. Just clarity. That calm unsettled him more than resistance would have. He stepped back toward his cruiser, radio in hand, running her name through the system. The static hissed in response. The database took longer than usual to load, as if even the signal hesitated. Behind him, a young man whispered to his phone camera, narrating what he thought was another routine traffic stop. Brooks glanced at the gathering, jaw tight. Stay right there, he said over his shoulder. Monica did not move. She lifted her face slightly toward the sky, letting the rain collect along her brow. There was something almost reflective in her expression, as though this moment was not new to her. When Brooks returned, his posture had shifted just slightly, uncertainty creeping in at the edges. "Your record is clean," he admitted, though it sounded like an accusation. He circled her once more, flashlight beam steady despite the fading light. The military jacket in the back seat caught his attention again. The insignia stitched along the collar was partially visible through the garment bag. He frowned, leaning closer to the glass, trying to make sense of the pattern. The rank markings were unfamiliar to him, complex, precise. He straightened, pride pushing back against doubt. "If you serve, you should know better than to cross a line on my road," he said, emphasizing the last words. "My road. My authority. My decision." Monica turned her head slightly toward him. "Officer," she replied quietly, "the law does not belong to any one man." The sentence lingered in the space between them. A distant rumble echoed across the highway, not thunder this time, but engines, low and synchronized, approaching from miles away. Brooks did not notice at first. He was too focused on proving a point that was already slipping through his fingers. The low rumble grew louder, steady and deliberate, cutting through the soft percussion of rain against metal and pavement. Officer Daniel Brooks finally turned his head toward the sound, brows tightening as a line of dark government SUVs emerged from the curve of the highway, headlights slicing through the mist in perfect alignment. They were not speeding, not flashing sirens, just moving with quiet purpose. The small crowd fell silent. Even the young man live streaming lowered his voice. Monica Hayes did not turn to look. She had heard those engines before, in deserts, on runways, outside briefing rooms where decisions shaped the lives of thousands. Brooks felt a flicker of irritation. Backup had not been requested. This was not his call. The first SUV came to a smooth stop about 20 feet from his cruiser. Then the second. Then the third. Doors opened in near unison. Men and women in crisp military uniforms stepped out, their boots landing on wet asphalt with controlled precision. No one ran. No one shouted. Authority did not need to raise its voice. Brooks straightened, instinctively adjusting his belt, his badge suddenly feeling heavier than usual. A tall officer with silver insignia on his chest approached, rain collecting along the brim of his cap. He glanced once at Monica, and something in his posture shifted instantly. He stood taller, sharper. He stopped 3 feet in front of her and brought his hand up in a clean, unwavering salute. The motion was precise, practiced, absolute. The air seemed to freeze around it. The crowd gasped softly. Brooks stared, confusion flashing across his face. "Sir," the approaching officer said, his voice calm but edged with unmistakable respect. "Are you all right?" Monica returned the salute with measured grace. "I am fine, Colonel," she replied. "Colonel." The word landed in Brooks's mind like a stone dropped into deep water. He looked from the insignia on the colonel's chest back to the garment bag in the rear seat of the sedan. The partially visible stars along the collar were no longer abstract shapes. They were rank. High rank. The colonel turned slowly toward Brooks. There was no anger in his eyes, only controlled assessment. "Officer," he said evenly, "do you understand who you have detained?" Brooks opened his mouth, then closed it. The rain felt colder now, seeping through fabric, down his collar. His radio crackled again, this time with urgency he had never heard directed at him. "Stand down immediately," dispatch instructed, voice tight. "Confirm identification and disengage." The young man across the street whispered, "Oh my God," into his phone. Monica lowered her hand from the salute and faced Brooks fully for the first time since the vehicles arrived. Her gaze was steady, not triumphant, not cruel, just clear. "You asked who I was," she said quietly. The colonel stepped slightly aside, revealing the 4 silver stars aligned on the shoulder of the jacket inside the vehicle. "This is General Monica Hayes," he stated with calm authority. The name echoed in the humid night air. 4 stars. The kind of rank that commanded divisions. The kind that answered directly to the highest offices in the nation. Brooks felt the ground beneath him shift, not physically, but in everything he thought he understood about power. He had believed the flashing lights behind him were the ultimate symbol of control. Now, standing in the rain, He realized he had stopped someone whose authority stretched far beyond a 2-mile stretch of highway. He thought he was enforcing order. Instead, he had just confronted it. For a moment, no one moved. The rain continued its steady rhythm against metal and fabric, but the world around Officer Daniel Brooks felt suspended, as if time itself were waiting for him to understand what had just happened. 4 silver stars. Not decorative. Not ceremonial. Authority at a level he had only seen on television during national briefings. His fingers, which moments earlier had pointed with certainty, now hovered uncertainly near his belt. The colonel's gaze did not waver. "Officer," he repeated calmly, "this is General Monica Hayes." The words were not loud, yet they carried more weight than any raised voice could. Brooks swallowed, the confidence that had once filled his chest replaced by a tightening pressure he could not name. He glanced at the small crowd across the street. Their phones were still raised, recording everything. The narrative had shifted, and he could feel it. Monica adjusted her posture slightly, rain tracing along the lines of her face, but she did not step back, and she did not step forward. She stood exactly where she had been asked to stand, hands visible, composed. The same dignity she had shown when he believed she was powerless remained unchanged now that her rank had been revealed. That steadiness unsettled him more than the arrival of the convoy. The colonel turned his attention briefly to the flashing cruiser lights. "General," he said with professional restraint, "do you require assistance?" She shook her head once. "No, Colonel. I am fine." Her voice was even, almost gentle, yet it carried command beneath the surface. Brooks felt the realization settle in layers. He had questioned her integrity. He had doubted her identity. He had assumed authority over someone whose decisions influenced thousands of service members across the globe. The irony pressed against him like the cold rain soaking through his uniform. Dispatch spoke again through his radio, this time more measured. "Officer Brooks, confirm disengagement." The word disengagement echoed in his mind. He slowly reached up and switched off the flashing lights. The highway dimmed, returning to ordinary darkness, though nothing about the moment felt ordinary. Monica took one small step closer, closing the distance just enough to meet him eye to eye without raising her voice. "Officer," she said quietly, "authority is not proven by how loudly you question someone. It is proven by how carefully you listen." There was no accusation in her tone, no triumph, only truth. Brooks opened his mouth, searching for something formal, something procedural, but all he managed was a restrained, "Yes, ma'am." The word felt unfamiliar, yet necessary. Around them, the soldiers remained still, disciplined, waiting for her signal rather than his. That contrast did not go unnoticed. In less than 10 minutes, the balance of power on that stretch of highway had inverted completely. Brooks had believed he was protecting order. Instead, he had tested it. The rain began to lighten, thinning into a mist that drifted under the streetlights. Monica turned slightly toward the colonel. "We are done here," she said. Simple. Final. The soldiers moved with quiet efficiency, returning to their vehicles without drama. As the engine started again, Brooks remained standing beside his cruiser, badge heavy against his chest, understanding dawning slowly. He had worn his authority like armor. Tonight, he had learned that true command did not need armor at all. The convoy began to pull away one vehicle at a time, engines humming low as tires rolled through shallow rainwater and disappeared into the dark stretch of highway. The flashing lights were gone now. No sirens. No spectacle. Just the quiet aftermath of a lesson neither man would forget. Officer Daniel Brooks stood beside his cruiser, shoulders no longer squared in command but heavy with awareness. Across the road, the small crowd slowly dispersed, murmuring to one another, their phones lowering as the moment lost its chaos and settled into memory. General Monica Hayes remained by her vehicle for a brief second longer, as if allowing the silence to fully form. The mist in the air softened the streetlights, casting a pale glow around her. Brooks cleared his throat, the sound small against the open road. "General," he said carefully, the word deliberate now, "I was performing my duty." It was not an excuse. It was a shield he had relied on for years. She studied him, not with anger, but with the measured patience of someone accustomed to evaluating character under pressure. "Duty," she repeated gently, "is not the same as assumption." The sentence lingered, steady and unhurried. Brooks felt it settle deeper than any reprimand could. He thought about the way he had approached her car, the tone he had used, the certainty he had felt. He had believed authority flowed only one direction, from his badge outward. Tonight, he had seen authority answer to something greater than ego. The highway stretched empty again, the world resuming its ordinary rhythm. Monica walked toward her sedan and paused by the open driver door. "Officer Brooks," she said without turning, "the uniform you wear represents trust. So does mine." She glanced briefly at the garment bag in the back seat, where 4 silver stars rested beneath clear plastic. Both can be damaged if worn carelessly. There was no threat in her voice, only truth. Brooks nodded once, the movement almost imperceptible. For the first time since he had joined the force, the badge on his chest felt less like protection and more like responsibility. He realized that power was not proven in the moments when someone appears small, but in how you choose to treat them before you know their rank. The rain finally stopped, leaving behind the scent of wet pavement and cooling asphalt. Monica stepped into her vehicle and closed the door softly. The engine started, smooth and controlled. As she drove past his cruiser, she did not look away, and she did not stare him down. She simply held his gaze for a second that felt longer than the entire encounter. Not victorious, not bitter, just steady. Brooks watched her taillights fade into the distance until the highway returned to darkness. He exhaled slowly, a breath he did not realize he had been holding. He had asked who she was with confidence. Now he understood that the better question had always been who he was choosing to become. On that quiet stretch of road, under fading clouds and cooling air, he learned that real authority does not demand respect. It earns it long before anyone asks. The highway eventually returned to its ordinary silence, but the moment did not leave with the rain. Officer Daniel Brooks remained parked on the shoulder for several minutes after General Monica Hayes disappeared into the dark, his hands resting on the steering wheel, eyes fixed ahead, yet seeing something entirely different. The red and blue lights were off now, replaced by the faint glow of his dashboard. Clock reading 9:42 p.m. The numbers felt precise, almost symbolic. A timestamp for the exact minute his understanding of authority shifted. He replayed the encounter in his mind, not the reveal of rank, not the convoy, but the first few seconds. The tone in his voice, the assumptions in his posture, the certainty that he was entitled to demand answers without offering respect. He had believed he was protecting order. Now he questioned whether he had been protecting his own pride instead. Dispatch checked in again, calmer this time, confirming that a formal report would be required. Brooks acknowledged the instruction clearly, each word measured. The young man who had been live streaming walked past his cruiser on the way back to his car and paused for a brief second. There was no hostility in his expression, only something closer to disappointment. That look lingered longer than any official reprimand could. Brooks drove back toward the precinct slowly, the tires humming along wet pavement, passing mile markers he had passed hundreds of times before. Tonight they felt different, as if each one marked the distance between who he had been at the beginning of the shift and who he might become after it. Inside the station, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Familiar desks, familiar lockers, familiar routines. Yet when he removed his hat and placed it on the metal shelf, the gesture carried more weight. He stared at his reflection in the small locker mirror, water still clinging to the edges of his collar. The badge on his chest reflected the harsh white light. For the first time, he did not see it as proof of authority. He saw it as a symbol that could either build trust or quietly erode it. Across town, in a quiet Arlington neighborhood, Monica stepped out of her sedan and walked toward her front door, the night air cool and steady. She paused briefly, looking up at the sky now cleared of clouds. Encounters like this were not new to her. Rank did not shield her from assumptions. But she carried something stronger than frustration. She carried discipline. She carried perspective. She carried the understanding that real command is measured not by how many salute you, but by how consistently you uphold dignity when no one does. Back at the precinct, Brooks sat down to write his report. He chose his words carefully, aware that documentation shapes narrative. As he typed, one sentence stayed with him, echoing in the quiet room. Authority is not ownership. It is stewardship. He did not know if he would ever see her again. He only knew that the next time he asked someone who they were, he would first consider who he was choosing to be. On that rain-soaked highway, Two uniforms met. One relied on power. The other embodied it. And in the silence that followed, the difference became impossible to ignore. The morning after the report was filed, the station felt different to Officer Daniel Brooks, though nothing in the building had physically changed. The same coffee machine hummed in the corner. The same bulletin board displayed reminders about community outreach and patrol schedules. Yet every conversation seemed slightly quieter when he walked past. News traveled quickly in a department that prided itself on hierarchy. By 8:30 a.m., his supervising lieutenant had already called him into the office. The door closed with a soft click, not dramatic, just final. "I reviewed your body camera footage," the lieutenant said evenly. There was no anger in his tone, only measured concern. Brooks stood straight, hands clasped behind his back, but this time the posture was not about dominance. It was about accountability. The lieutenant continued, "You followed procedure on paper. But leadership is more than procedure." The sentence struck him harder than any formal reprimand. He nodded once. "Yes, sir." The footage had been clear. His tone, his assumptions. The moment he had leaned into authority instead of listening. Across town, General Monica Hayes sat in a briefing room at the Pentagon, sunlight cutting through tall windows and casting sharp lines across polished floors. Officers from multiple branches listened as she outlined logistics for an upcoming overseas deployment. Her voice was steady, deliberate, never rushed. No mention of the highway. No mention of the stop. Professionalism meant separating personal experience from mission focus. Yet as she paused to review a map projected on the wall, she thought briefly about the young officer standing in the rain the night before. Not with resentment. With reflection. Power, she understood, revealed character when challenged. Back at the precinct, Brooks returned to patrol later that afternoon, this time assigned to community detail rather than highway enforcement. The shift was subtle but intentional. He parked near a small neighborhood park where children were, riding bicycles along cracked sidewalks. A woman pushing a stroller glanced at him cautiously. He felt that familiar instinct rise in him, the urge to command space. Instead, he stepped out slowly, offering a simple nod. "Good afternoon." No edge, no presumption. The woman hesitated, then nodded back. Small moments, small shifts. He realized that rebuilding trust did not require dramatic gestures. It required consistency. As the hours passed, he responded to minor calls, spoke with shop owners, and listened more than he spoke. The badge on his chest felt the same weight as before, but its meaning had shifted. That night on the highway had not stripped him of authority. It had redefined it. Somewhere miles away, Monica stood at attention as junior officers saluted her in passing. She returned each salute with the same discipline she had shown in the rain. Rank, she knew, demanded humility more than pride. Authority, when worn correctly, protected without humiliating. As evening settled over the city once again, Brooks ended his shift by sitting quietly in his cruiser for a moment before turning the engine off. He thought about the question he had asked. He thought about the answer he had received without anger, without spectacle. Sometimes the most powerful correction is not delivered in a courtroom or shouted across a crowd. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in the rain, and stays long after the storm has passed. He had worn a badge to enforce the law. Now he was learning how to honor it. 3 days later, the rain returned, lighter this time, tapping softly against storefront windows along Main Street, as Officer Daniel Brooks stood beneath the awning of a neighborhood grocery store during his evening patrol. The air smelled like wet concrete and fresh bread drifting from inside. He had been reassigned permanently to community engagement detail pending review, a decision framed as development rather than discipline. At first it felt like demotion. Now it felt like instruction. A group of teenagers lingered near the entrance, glancing at him the way people often did, measuring uniform before man. Brooks approached slowly, hands relaxed at his sides. "Evening," he said, voice calm. One of the boys nodded cautiously. Another avoided eye contact. Brooks remembered the highway, the flashing lights, the certainty in his tone. He chose differently this time. "You all staying dry out here?" A small smile appeared on one of their faces. The tension eased by a fraction. It was not dramatic. No applause. No revelation. Just space created where suspicion might have grown. Across the river in Arlington, General Monica Hayes prepared for a press briefing related to the upcoming deployment. Cameras lined the back of the room, reporters adjusting microphones and checking notes. When she stepped to the podium, the room quieted instantly. Authority without demand. She delivered updates with clarity, outlining timelines, safety protocols, and commitments to service members and their families. Near the end, a reporter asked about leadership under pressure. She paused, considering her words carefully. Leadership, she said, is tested most clearly in small moments. Not when everyone salutes you, but when no one has to. The sentence was not about the highway, yet it carried the echo of it. Back in the neighborhood, Brooks accepted a cup of coffee from the store owner, who had once filed a complaint about patrol behavior months earlier. On the house, the owner said quietly. Brooks hesitated, then accepted with a nod. Thank you. He did not know if forgiveness had been granted, but he knew trust was being reconsidered. That mattered. Later that night, as he completed paperwork in his cruiser, his phone vibrated with a department-wide memo. A new training initiative on implicit bias and community trust had been approved. Mandatory attendance. Brooks read the details slowly. He could have viewed it as criticism. Instead, he saw it as opportunity. The highway had exposed something in him he could not ignore. Growth rarely arrives comfortably. Sometimes it arrives in flashing lights and public silence. Sometimes it arrives through the steady gaze of someone who refuses to surrender dignity. Monica concluded her briefing and stepped away from the podium, returning salutes from junior officers in the hallway. Ranks surrounded her, yet humility steadied her stride. She understood that influence extended beyond battle plans and strategy rooms. It lived in everyday encounters, in patience, in restraint. As night settled again over both sides of the river, Brooks drove past the same stretch of highway where everything had shifted. The pavement was dry now, streetlights glowing steady above empty lanes. He slowed briefly, not out of fear, but reflection. Authority had once felt like a weapon he carried. Now it felt like a promise he had to keep. On that road, two uniforms had crossed paths. One tested the limits of power. The other revealed its true measure. And somewhere between rain and silence, a lesson took root that neither would forget. A week later, the highway carried its usual rhythm of headlights and late-night commuters, unaware that it had once been the setting for a quiet reckoning. Officer Daniel Brooks parked along the shoulder, not to stop anyone, but to watch the steady flow of traffic under clear skies. The air was crisp, just under 60 degrees, the kind of night where sound traveled farther than expected. He stepped out of his cruiser and stood for a moment, listening to the distant hum of engines, thinking about how quickly certainty can dissolve when confronted with truth. The department training sessions had begun that morning. Long hours in a fluorescent-lit room, reviewing footage, discussing bias, listening to community voices that described encounters shaped more by perception than evidence. Brooks did not speak much during the session. He listened, really listened. He recognized pieces of himself in the scenarios presented. Not malicious, not cruel, but careless in ways that could cause harm without intention. Across town, General Monica Hayes prepared to leave for her overseas assignment. Her residence was quiet as she placed her uniform jacket carefully into a travel garment case. For silver stars reflected softly in the room light. Rank had taken decades to earn. Respect had taken even longer. Before stepping out, she paused briefly by the window, looking toward the distant skyline. She did not think about confrontation. She thought about responsibility. Leadership meant carrying composure into every room, every road, every unexpected moment. Back on the highway, Brooks watched as a sedan drifted slightly near the white line before correcting itself. His hand hovered near the radio out of habit. Then he lowered it. Not every imperfection required escalation. Not every pause required suspicion. He understood now that the badge did not grant him ownership over people's dignity. It entrusted him with its protection. The memory of that night no longer burned with embarrassment. It steadied him with awareness. He remembered the calm in her eyes. The way she had stood without surrendering composure. The way authority had arrived without shouting. That image had rewritten something inside him. Days later, at a community meeting held in the same neighborhood where he had once been viewed with distance, Brooks spoke briefly. About accountability. His words were not rehearsed. Authority, he said, voice even, is strongest when it listens first. The room remained quiet, but the silence felt thoughtful rather than tense. Change rarely announces itself with applause. It reveals itself in consistency. Somewhere over the Atlantic, Monica reviewed mission documents beneath dim cabin lights as the aircraft cruised at 35,000 feet. Responsibility surrounded her, yet she remained grounded in something simpler. Dignity does not depend on recognition. It depends on character. On a quiet stretch of American highway, two uniforms had crossed paths. One carried flashing lights. The other carried 4 stars. But in the end, neither symbol defined the lesson. The lesson was this: power can demand obedience, but only character earns respect. He had worn a badge believing it made him the law. She carried her rank knowing it made her accountable to it. And long after the rain had dried, the truth remained clear. When authority forgets humility, it falters. When dignity stands firm, it teaches.